It's back to basics as Atari Archive visits Activision's Tennis. Our final March 1981 release for this series is another sports game from the folks at Activision. While tennis as a sport has been a standby for game makers almost as long as video games have existed, Alan Miller's rendition was one of the earliest attempts to make a version of the sport that was more accurate than what you'd gotten out of Pong clones the previous decade. The obvious through line here is, of course, Atari's Pong itself. Though Pong was in turn heavily inspired, some would say a rip-off even, from the ping-pong game on the Magnavox Odyssey. The Odyssey's original game, designed by Bill Roosh in 1967, is very clearly the genesis of Atari's arcade smash hit. The players each control a single white spot, with a smaller spot being bounced between the two. The English knob allows them to control its movements after being hit, but otherwise they have free reign over the field. The Odyssey team, consisting of Roosh, Bill Harrison, and the team leader Ralph Baer, even developed a method of using the nascent cable television technology to underlay an image of a tennis court on the screen, though this was never picked up by cable companies at the time due to a recession. The released version of the Odyssey also included a tennis game, though really this was more of a change of overlays. When Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell came across the Odyssey during the Magnavox Profit Caravan trade show, he tasked new hire Al Alcorn with developing a simplified version to familiarize himself with the circuitry used in Atari's arcade technology. The resulting game was fun enough that Alcorn and the other co-founder, Ted Dabney, convinced Bushnell to give it a trial run for a commercial release, and the game's success, and Atari's own struggle to fulfill the demand for the game, led to a slew of clones in arcades, and later in the home as technology progressed. This also led to a series of lawsuits from Magnavox and Sanders Associates, which held the patents on video game technology, including the Odyssey ping-pong game. And this, in turn, unearthed the nearly forgotten history of an earlier tennis game. This earlier tennis game came from a scientist named Willie Higinbotham, who had been involved earlier in his career on developing radar technology and the atomic bomb. Higinbotham was also a creative, and after taking a job at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, found an outlet for his energy during the lab's annual open houses. The static displays explaining what they did were not terribly interesting to the average attendee, and Higinbotham had the idea of demonstrating their technology by getting their analog Donner Model 30 computer to play a game. Working alongside technician Robert Dvorak, the two had assembled what they had called the Brookhaven Computer Tennis Game, a side-view display on an oscilloscope where players used a control knob and button to set the angle of their shot before knocking the ball back over the net in real time. The game was popular upon its October 1958 debut, and returned the following year with new parameters, such as different gravity levels. Higinbotham considered it fairly minor compared to his work fighting the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the game was largely forgotten until it came up during Magnavox's legal suits. It also re-entered public consciousness when creative computing editor David Ahl wrote about it, having serendipitously played it during its debut in 1958. Higginbotham's game is indeed an isolated and minor part of the history of video tennis on its own, but it has developed something of a mythos surrounding it thanks to these later events under a retroactive name, Tennis for Two. By the programmable era, several of the home game systems had some spin on Pong or tennis, from the Channel F's built-in games to the standalone cartridges found on the RCA Studio 2, the Bally Arcade, and the Atari VCS. But it wasn't until 1981 that there were any attempts at a true tennis video game. Mattel brought its own tennis game to market reportedly around January 1981, which reuses the side-view approach seen in Pong or even Higginbotham's game. This is coupled with a more accurate rendition of the sport with physical players, a court, two types of shots, and actual tennis rules. But Mattel's tennis suffers from the side view. With this alignment, it proves remarkably difficult to gauge where your people are in relation to the ball, and since the players also have to manually push a button to return the ball, it ends up being pretty easy to whiff. It's also a strictly two-player game, which means that you'd have to find someone else interested enough in tennis to give it a whirl. Activision's game appears to have come out shortly after Mattel's, so this seems to have been an instance of parallel development. Alan Miller took a somewhat different approach for Mattel with his VCS game, however, and fundamentally altered how video tennis games handled the sport for decades after its release. While Miller did not sit for an interview with me, we can glean quite a bit about the development of tennis from contemporary interviews he gave. In the 1982 book Video Invaders, a 1982 issue of Electronic Games, and a 1983 interview with Creative Computing. Through these sources, Miller explains that he and fellow Activision developer David Crane had been playing in the USTA amateur tennis tournaments since around 1978, and they were both fans of the game. And this led him to feel he could do a faithful rendition on the VCS, using little men and a rounded bouncing ball. Prior to forming Activision, Miller had made basketball for the VCS and Atari computer line, notable for its 3/4 perspective display, which Miller wanted to revisit. He combined the two ideas into one with his tennis game, taking 2 weeks to create a display and then spending about 3 months developing the play and polishing it. Miller shifted the perspective of the game from basketball, and indeed, earlier Pong-style games, with the two players located at the top and bottom of the screen. This is a very standard configuration for tennis video games now, but it was incredibly novel at the time. This change makes tennis much easier to play than the one on Intellivision. If the ball is out of your reach, it is far easier to tell that's the case here than in Mattel's version. Additionally, Miller said he had heard feedback about basketball from players who were having a hard time lining up their shots with the net, as it was difficult to determine exactly where the players and the ball were on the court. So for tennis, he gave the ball a shadow that would indicate to players where, exactly, it was located on the court, something he said was pretty trivial to add but made all the difference in making this a legitimately good take on the sport, as it provides the illusion of depth on the court needed for the perspective to truly work. Further improving upon basketball, Miller was able to add 5 different running animations and a smooth racket swing, compared to the 2-frame running animation of his earlier game. The tennis game code itself fit into 2 kilobytes of space at a time when games were routinely in the 4K cartridge size range, as Activision's developers continued to challenge themselves to produce advanced games in as little space as possible. Tennis follows the rules of the sport pretty closely. The players, or one player and the computer, compete to win 6 games and to be ahead by 2 games to win the set. Scoring follows the traditional tennis rules of jumping from 0 to 15 to 30 and 40, with deuces taking place when both players are tied at 40 to see who gets the match point opportunity. Whoever gets past 40 points first wins the game. The ball is knocked out of bounds if it doesn't bounce within the court boundaries before being hit, though it is counted as good as long as the opponent hits the ball. The ball can only bounce off the ground within the court 1 time before being counted as a point. And between games, the players will switch who is serving the ball to begin with and who is on which side of the court. Hitting the ball is done automatically once your player has gotten close enough to it, with the angle dependent on which part of the racket the ball touches. The controller's button is used solely for serving the ball at the start of each match, though players can adjust their position to affect which way the ball will go. The difficulty switches on the VCS adjust whether or not the players can hit really wide shots that go cross-court, while the select switch adjusts if the game will be played by 1 or 2 players, and if it'll run at full speed or half speed. Much as in basketball, the computer is an adept opponent here who very rarely will let the ball past it unless it's being knocked cross-court, and if you adjusted the difficulty switches to narrow the range of shots, this is made all the more difficult. Nevertheless, once a player has gotten a feel for tennis, it is possible to overcome the computer either way. The half-speed modes are an effective way to get the hang of the game, though once you get used to it at full speed, it's difficult to go back. With 2 players, the game continues to be a contest over spacing. Cross-court shots are still the best way to get the ball past your opponent, and volleys can get very fast and exciting. Tennis is a fun single-player experience, but with another person, it proves to be a top-notch competitive game on the VCS. Like David Crane's Laser Blast, Tennis was initially anticipated for an April release, but seems to have started arriving in stores the month prior, as there are newspaper ads for it towards the end of March. And also, much like Laser Blast, Tennis seemed to be very well received, though it did not reach the sales heights or notoriety of its March brethren. The game won Best Competitive Game in the 1981 Archie Awards in the pages of Video Magazine and Electronic Games, which describes it as far removed from Pong-style games as Gasoline is from dinosaurs and a game of aim over reflexes. It was also the runner-up in Best Sports Game that same year. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz reviewed the game itself in the July 1981 issue of Video, gushing about the ball's shadow, the 3-dimensional perspective, and the realism to its physics. They wrote about it further in the first issue of Electronic Games, dubbing it one of the best designed video games available on the market, and one that could blow your mind if you were raised on Pong. Creative Computing gave it a short, glowing preview in its winter CES coverage, before reviewing it in more depth in September. David All wrote that while he never mastered it after hours of play, he had fun trying. Of course, game development marches on, and while Miller's take on the sport was the prime example of how tennis could be done, eventually other developers tried to pick up the gauntlet he had thrown down. Atari published Realsports tennis on the VCS and 5200 in April 1983, mimicking Miller's perspective, but adding some additional bells and whistles, such as a scoreboard and different kinds of shots. And on the 5200, a doubles mode that allows up to 4 players. On other platforms, the generally maligned Arcadia 2001 system came out alongside Grand Slam Tennis. And while this seems fairly basic, even in comparison to Activision's game, it features remarkably smooth animation. On the ColecoVision there is Tournament Tennis, a late 1984 game from iMagic that largely apes the Realsports tennis version of the game. These all play reasonably well, though interestingly, the lack of automatic returns like the Activision game give these a much steeper learning curve. With the perspective being what it is, it's easy to misjudge your shots and whiff, allowing the ball to fly right past you. 1985 saw the debut of tennis for the NES in its New York test market, though this was also a 1984 release in another territory that simply did not show up in North America until the excess stock left from the market crash had worked through the system. This rendition was certainly not widely available at the time, which is unfortunate. The game's speed and fidelity really makes it feel like a true successor to the Activision VCS game. Given that Activision's games were not sold in Japan, it's unclear if Nintendo's designers had ever seen Alan Miller's take directly, but it's plausible that they were exposed to the viewpoint for the sport he had pioneered from some other game, if not his own. The game was well received from the few English-language reviews that existed. Computer Entertainer praised the effects of showing the ball getting closer to the camera and the cartoonish visuals, while noting that it oddly doesn't allow 2 players to go against each other or have them switch sides on the court. It's possible Nintendo's developers just didn't want to deal with any potential disadvantage one player may have had from the camera. Finally, in 1986, a Europe-only Intellivision game called Championship Tennis made its way to North America, courtesy of INTV, which had bought the rights to the platform from Mattel as the game's market was melting down. Originally planned for the system's ECS expansion, this version was finished by Nice Ideas in France for the standalone Intellivision console and sold in Europe in 1985 before being imported by INTV. Thankfully, Nice Ideas dropped the horizontal tennis court from the earlier Intellivision game, utilizing Miller's vertical perspective while also adding in multiple court types, game speeds, and single, 2, and no player modes. Much like the 5200 game, this also includes the option for doubles, with the computer taking over the other players on the court. Controls are otherwise much like the previous Mattel Tennis release, and while those weren't the primary issue with that older game, here they function more or less fine. Yet Championship Tennis still retains some odd problems of its own. The hitbox on the ball is hard to figure out, and shots that look like they should connect with your racket just don't. You effectively can really only hit the ball properly if it's right in front of you and you swing early, which means you don't have as much control over where you're aiming as you'd want. Serving is also a real learning curve to get the right timing out to avoid a fault. Even the computer routinely messes it up at lower difficulty levels. In pursuit of a more realistic game experience, the Intellivision, for a second time, ends up with something that's a bit too messy really to be recommended, though it's possible this is a game that just needs more time with it to really shine. Computer Entertainer praised it for giving you a lot of control over where the type of shot you make and where your ball is landing. In either case, these are problems, and in fairness, options, that Miller's games simply did not have, and I imagine someone really into tennis games would consider this a much better option. With the developments in the video tennis genre in the 40 years since Activision's game released, Miller's game can seem incredibly simplistic and even bare bones. With that said, these qualities work to its advantage. Tennis is fast, exciting, and straightforward enough that even newcomers can have a blast, particularly with a partner. Much like basketball before it, this cartridge holds up remarkably well, and it's another prime example of a sports game done well on the VCS. Next time, the VCS brings an analog arcade experience to the digital realm.